The DC thugs are messing with their rules again. This time it's another reshaping of the so-called census. And their machinations reveal a heck of a lot to people who believe in freedom and who can actually read their so-called rule book, the Constitution. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV. Yes, indeed, we all know examples abound of the dismissive manner in which the U.S. political office holders treat their oaths to protect and defend their U.S. Constitution. And some of these examples are more flagrantly evident than others. There are entire departments, such as the Department of Education, that clearly are not sanctioned by any enumerated so-called power of the Constitution. In fact, most of the offices in DC aren't permitted without an amendment to actually allow them. But one of the most readily recognizable, one of the biggest tells about how government operatives attempt to pander to people by splitting them into various groups and dangling tax-funded manna over them, why, it's the U.S. Census. The census itself is mandated by the so-called rules of the Constitution, but for years, Americans have had the opportunity to look at the simple, plain language of that provision in the Constitution and compare it with the central government's behavior, and then judge how ridiculous that behavior is. Now, with a new expansion of the Census Bureau's so-called mission, Americans also can see how easily the DC politicians themselves could recognize and call for an end of this improper activity. And we can acknowledge that most of the politicians are part of the problem. Suzanne Gamboa reports for NBC that the Census Bureau's pseudo-gods this year have decided to split the U.S. population into even more disparate groups, adding Hispanic/Latino and Middle Eastern/North African, the meanings of which, of course, are highly debated and will offer hours of after-school gaming fun for bored kids. Quote, for the first time, Hispanic or Latino is listed as one race/ethnicity category, and people of Middle Eastern or North African descent will have their own checkbox under new race and ethnicity standards adopted by the Biden administration. Which is curious, since the term race and ethnicity standards doesn't appear in the document Biden swore to uphold. But hey, he doesn't uphold pretty much all of it, right? So why change now? Up to now, Hispanics had a two-part question for their identity. They were asked whether they were Hispanic or Latino, and then asked to pick a race of white, black, American Indian, or some other race. Wonderful. If you detect a certain amount of needless complexity in that process, almost as if you're a flying crow looking down at road detours that government has erected for people while you can see the direct route to fly, well, you're not alone. The change now uses one question for race and ethnicity and allows people to check as many as apply to their identity. Each category has subcategories with examples that may apply and room for those that may not be listed. But at least when Gamboa writes the term identity, she doesn't mean that Americans can fill out their forms with any heritage or race they feel like during any flight of fancy. Actually, it might be fun to see people do that, because if Americans did it en masse, such a disruption in racial targeting would undermine this entire exercise, this trite exercise in cultural Marxism and welfarism. Adds Gamboa, quote, the addition of a Middle Eastern or North African or MENA identifier would allow 7 million to 8 million people to no longer have to identify as white or other on the census and other forms in which such data is collected. Why should anyone have to identify as anything other than being a resident of a particular state? According to the strict wording of the U.S. Constitution, the census is supposed to be an enumeration, a counting of people in each state. It's not supposed to be used to break that state population into racial categories or male and female, or to find out their ages or know how many people are in each house. The census workers, well, they could actually read the Constitution for a change, and so could Biden if they wanted to bother. If they could spare the time, they could flip to Article 1, Section 2. And while some politicians might whisper to gullible audiences that the latter portion of the clause allows the Congress to instantiate racial obsession in the census, the word enumeration means what it says. It's a counting, period. It's absurd and fallacious to think or claim that a counting of a population for the purposes of so-called representation in Congress can be turned into a massive invasion of privacy and race-baiting system. Whoever can get the power gets the goods, and splitting people into racial categories allows the politicians to wield tremendous power to hand out money and play favorites. They're not supposed to do that at all. But of course, since when did the Constitution stop the thieves and liars? Quote, the changes are only the second update by the federal government to categories for data about the American population. The update, the last was in 1997, of standards used by the federal government for the census and other agencies is meant to better capture the expanding multicultural identity of the country. Again, it's all about handouts and gaming the dirty system that logically and philosophically actually can never provide real representation in any way whatsoever. Everyone from Senator Liz Warren, the Democrat of Massachusetts, to Rhino Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, likely knows this fact about government, and they probably know it very well. Thus reports Gamboa, quote, these updated standards are going to help us create more useful, accurate, and up-to-date federal data on race and ethnicity, said an official with the Office of Management and Budget, who spoke to reporters Tuesday on the condition that the person not be identified. The wording of the Constitution doesn't allow them to do that. But of course they've done it, and much, much more, for a long time. Wouldn't it be great to get as many things as possible away from the hands of government, and so therefore not have to operate under this canard that somehow all these people can be represented by so few so-called representatives? I might have one opinion, you might have another opinion, but the representative is supposed to represent us both? I don't get it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please like and subscribe, and of course, watch out for the census people because they're gonna want all your information. Isn't it great? Check us out on Rumble where they don't censor us. And of course, we are on YouTube where they do censor us. Census, censor? Anyway, you can also find us at MRCTV.org, MRCTV.org, where you'll find what the whole team is doing. Check out the MRC Store while you're there, and please consider donating to the Media Research Center in its fight against left-wing bias in the media. You can find us on Instagram, TikTok, Inside Facebook, and on X. And if you want to find me on Gab, I'm at Gardner Goldsmith, and on Twitter/X, I'm at Gard Goldsmith. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.
I want to invite you as my guest on a very special, once-in-a-lifetime, 7-day post-election cruise in the Caribbean. It's going to be a blast.